Yo, what's good everyone? This is Ayo Boxing with Mediba, and we're here to talk about if Frank Martin is ready for Gervonta Tank Davis. So today was the final press conference for Gervonta Tank Davis versus Frank Martin, and it was interesting. A lot of shit talking, especially from Tank. This tells me that this should be a good fight. Matter of fact, the entire card is full of good fights, so I'm looking forward to Saturday. But back to Tank versus Frank. Despite being a contender, I think Frank will be Tank's best opponent to date from a style standpoint. Tank has mostly fought come-forward type of fighters, and a majority of them have been Latino. Frank, on the other hand, is a slick boxer-puncher, African-American, and this is essentially the first time we've seen Tank fight this style. The same thing can be said for Frank, so this should be an interesting matchup, and it should tell us a lot about both fighters, especially Tank since he's linked to names such as Shakur Stevenson and Devin Haney. I have Tank beating Frank. I'm expecting a mid to late round stoppage, most likely a knockout from a counterpunch, but I will not sleep on Frank. He has good skills, good power, and is a hungry underdog. However, is Frank really ready for Tank? And when I mean that, I mean mentally and emotionally. And to be honest, I'm not sure. The reason why I'm not worried about Frank's readiness from a physical or a skill standpoint is because he's trained by Derrick James. I'm 100% confident that Frank will have a good preparation and be in top tier shape come fight night. And despite the gap in experience, Frank will have a good corner, especially when it comes to adjustments. However, Derrick James can't fight for Frank. A perfect example of what I mean is what happened to Jermell Charlo in the Canelo fight. Despite all the good instructions given to Charlo never followed through with it. The same thing can happen to Frank. Charlo was intimidated by Canelo. He was intimidated mostly due to the size and power difference, but the moment was way too big for Charlo. This was the biggest fight of Charlo's career. It was on a totally different scale and stage than any of his previous fights, and rather than living up to the moment, he shrank away from it, and this is why I'm concerned for Frank. This is the biggest fight of his career. Tank is the face of American boxing, and he has an aura to him. Tank was groomed and modeled by Mayweather to be at the highest levels of boxing. He's been through the motions plenty of times. Frank, on the other hand, hasn't. He's been an underdog his entire career. He started boxing late at the age of 17, and was fighting on small shows and cards until he got Derrick James and Errol Spence. He then became a staple undercard fighter for the PBC and would headline as the A-side in his last two fights at the Cosmopolitan, which is a theater and a small casino. He was never a media darling that got tons of exposure, especially when it comes to non-boxing sources. Only hardcore fans, along with a good percentage of casuals, know him and follow him. So I can't imagine how different it is for him to headline as the B-side at the MGM Grand in a pay-per-view fight against Gervonta Tank Davis. It's probably a mix of excitement and nervousness, but the nervousness appears to be showing on Frank. In the first press conference, it looked like Tank got in Frank's head. From Tank walking straight up to him, to Tank saying he was from the suburbs, to Tank mentioning his girl, and to Tank bringing up the sparring, even showing him the footage. Not saying that Frank was scared, but it definitely annoyed him and riled him up. He looked a bit unsettled, and you have to remember that Tank is a master at head games, no Diddy. For example, Tank didn't show up to the grand arrivals. Apparently he went for a run instead, but this seemed to bother Frank since he mentioned it in today's press conference. Frank seemed more settled and focused today, but Tank was talking a lot of shit to Frank throughout the whole thing. No matter who you are, that will get underneath your skin. But what stands out to me the most is Frank constantly talking about the sparring he had with Tank. He apparently clipped Tank during a spar, and this seemed to give Frank a lot of confidence. This could be a good thing going into the fight, but it could become an issue if it turns into overconfidence, because Tank also has a lot of confidence from that sparring. He claims that Frank was nervous before and during the spar, and Frank clenched most of the time in fear of getting hit. But sparring is not the same as an actual fight. Both of these guys have trained for weeks, specifically to fight one another. Tank, however, has done it way more than Frank on this high level. For example, Tank alluded to having spies in Frank's camp by saying he knows all of his sparring partners. The worst thing that could happen to Frank is for him to doubt himself and then lose his composure in the ring, because anything that Tank lands will draw a response from the crowd, and from my knowledge, that will affect a fighter's mentality. I feel like this may happen come fight night, but I could be wrong. Frank could be 100% ready for everything and maybe upset Tank. But who knows, this is boxing, anything can happen. But thank you for tuning in with Ayo Boxing from Mediba. Hit like, subscribe, and more content's coming your way.